So as we look at this whole concept of speaking the helpful truth, I find it to be valuable to have a kind of case example or multiple case examples, and I will share them from time to time because knowing what somebody else's experience has been like can be very helpful. And all of the case examples that I'm going to share are true, but they're slightly disguised in order to protect people's privacy. All right, this is a guy called Jim. I've told this story a lot, so you may have heard this in another setting. This was some years back when I was doing a group intervention group for aggressive offenders, and he was a pretty non-aggressive guy. He was pretty passive, pretty much out of touch with his feelings. But he had done something abusive to his daughter that his wife was concerned about, and so she contacted the authorities, and the children's division was brought in. The police were alerted. The prosecutor said, this is not a big enough deal. Anyway, so there were no criminal charges brought, but it did make it to the family court. And the family court said, Jim, you got to live separately while you complete treatment. So he moved out, but he wanted his family to continue to be supported, and he was the only breadwinner. So he gave all of his paycheck to his wife so that she could take care of herself and the daughter. And he moved back in with his folks. Now, Jim was someone who had no recollection of ever having been abused himself. He remembered seeing his dad abuse his sister and his mom, but he'd never been abused. Although he did recall that when he was probably about 4 years old and he was in the emergency room getting a gash on his head sewn up, that the nurse had asked him, oh, did you get this falling down the stairs? And he said, no, my dad threw me into the radiator. He had not yet learned that he was supposed to lie about that. But for the most part, Jim was pretty much unaware of what it was that he was feeling. Certainly had no sense of any kind of significant abuse of which he was the victim. So it became really significant for us when this was a Monday evening group. He came in one Monday evening. He was angry. It's like, oh, good. Jim, what's going on? You're angry. So during check-in, he shared that the previous Sunday morning, he was in the kitchen fixing his breakfast, frying up some eggs, and at the point at which he had the spatula in the pan to get the eggs out, his dad comes into this kitchen, small kitchen, coffee pot's right next to the stove. Dad pushes him to the side, and the eggs go sailing off the spatula and onto the floor. Whoa, Jim, so what happened? He said, my dad poured himself a cup of coffee and went out to the breakfast nook to read the paper. Okay, but what did you do? He said, I cleaned up the eggs. Well, right, but what did you say to your dad? And he said, I'm not going to say anything to my dad. That's just the way my dad is. My dad's always been that way. My dad's not going to change. Oh, good. Okay, so we're really clear here that your dad's not going to change, but you're angry because there's something you need that you're not getting. You know what that is. Now, we had to talk about that for a little bit. It took a while for him to kind of figure out, okay, what is it that I need? And what was missing for him was the quality of respect. He needed a relationship in which his dad would respect him. Well, is there anything, Jim, that you can do within the relationship that you have with your dad, which will give you more respect, can kind of help you feel more self-respect? I said, well, I guess I could tell him how I was feeling. I said, okay, awesome. So we worked with this a while, and what we came up with was that he was going to say, Dad, when you push me to one side and my eggs end up on the floor and you don't acknowledge that you did that, it feels to me as though you don't have respect for me, and I need a relationship in which we treat each other with respect. He was very clear. That was what he was going to say to his dad. Well, he wasn't going to go back and talk about it. But if in the future, at any point, his dad should treat him just respectfully, which was certain to happen because that was pretty much the way his dad treated him, that's what Jim would do. So next week, Jim comes back to group and we say, well, Jim, how'd it go? He said, it didn't work. So it didn't work. What didn't work? Tell us about it. He said, I was sitting in the living room. I was reading the newspaper. My dad walks into the room and I'm just sitting there reading the newspaper, and my dad takes the newspaper right out of my hand. And I remembered And I said, Dad, when you take the newspaper out of my hands, when I'm reading it, it feels to me like you don't have any respect for me. And I need a relationship in which we treat each other with respect. Wow, Jim, that's awesome. Good job. What happened? My dad looked at me like I had two heads, and he sat down and he read the newspaper. Okay. So how did it feel when you said that? And Jim had to think about that a minute because he really wasn't paying attention to himself. He was paying attention to what was going on around him. And he said, well, actually, it felt kind of good. I mean, my dad doesn't normally look at me. When he looked at me, when I said that, it was sort of like he was seeing me, even if he saw me like I had two heads. So, okay, did it feel good enough that you would be willing to do it again? Jim considered that and said, yeah, he thought he would. Okay. So over the next couple of months, while he completed the treatment program, each week he would report on what had happened this week when his dad had treated him disrespectfully and what it was that he said and how it was that his dad responded. And the shift in Jim was that little by little, more and more, he began to feel self-respect. It became easier and easier for him to make the speech. And occasionally he would notice his dad starting to do something that would have been disrespectful and then didn't. And he didn't know whether this was his dad coming to respect him or whether his dad just didn't want to hear the speech. But in either case, this was a transformation of Jim within the context of the system that he had with his father in such a way that Jim was creating more of what it was that he needed. Now, we don't have any input on how it was that things worked out between Jim and his dad. Jim moved back home. Don't know about how his relationship with his dad might have changed after that. But it's pretty likely that whenever he did get together with his dad, when his dad would do something disrespectful, Jim would say, Dad, when you do this, and he would describe very clearly, this is what happened in such a way that his dad would agree, yeah, that just happened. And Jim would say, and this is the impact that it had on me. And Jim is the world's expert on his own truth. This is what's true for me, is saying Jim. And he's describing what it is that he needs. He's describing the quality that's missing within the relationship that would make it better for him and presumably for everyone. So he's speaking a truth that is helpful insofar as it moves the system towards a greater balance, fairness, justice, stability. That's essentially what we're looking at doing. Speaking the helpful truth is an immensely powerful thing to do when we do it consistently. If at one point I speak the truth, that's helpful, and the other person doesn't change, and I say, well, see, I couldn't change him, I'm kind of giving up on the process before I really tried it. It requires a transformation of myself to know what is true, to know what it is that I need, and to consistently speak that into the relationship for this transformation to happen. Very simple, almost impossible. All right, we're going to pick up on giving you more of the detail in terms of the theory. Take care.